Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Keir Starmer's allies have some questionable tactics up their sleeves to prevent a leadership challenge by Andy Burnham. We've got an interview with Meghan Bodette from the Kurdish Peace Institute about the future of Syria. We spoke to her from those Kurdish-controlled regions of Syria. Really interesting interview. Also, new data suggests that liberal democracy is close to collapse. I like that. Just also, by the way, I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Great to have you on board this Friday evening.
Absolutely. My second Friday in the co-host chair in the studio. Looking forward to some more heated discussion.
In the studio.
Very calm but heated
Which
discussion.
one of us is defending liberal democracy from death?
Well, the viewers have to keep watching to find out.
Keep watching to find out. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Labour currently has as its leader the least popular Prime Minister of all time. Not a great situation. But with inevitable electoral defeat looming, the higher-ups appear to have one priority. Make sure no one popular can replace him as Labour leader. They got the most unpopular Prime Minister of all time. The worst thing that there could possibly be would be an alternative. The campaign to stop Andy Burnham has, of course, gone into overdrive. Yesterday, we learned Andrew Gwynn would be resigning as MP for Gordon and Denton, his Manchester constituency. Andy Burnham clearly wants it. He needs a way into Westminster to stand as leader, but party bosses have other ideas. Sienna Rogers of Politics Home has reported this. Politics Home understands that the current leadership has sent a clear message to key supporters within the party that Burnham will not be allowed to stand as Labour's candidate in Gorton and Denton. Some have suggested he could be blocked by Labour's ruling National Executive Committee, drawing up a list of female candidates only for Gorton and Denton. A senior Labour source has told Politics Home that the party could decide to run an all-BAME shortlist of candidates. If you're going to have a kind of woke reason, decide which one it is. Sorry, you can't stand because we really need a woman to be... Actually, we really need a non-white person to be standing. I mean, the commitment to feminism, to anti-racism, really impressive. Obviously, anyone who thinks this is a stitch-up clearly doesn't care about people of colour or women. So I won't call it a stitch-up because I do not want to be attacked on those grounds. This is actually really impressive. It's really good to see the Labour NEC putting its money where its mouth is. Women matter to the Labour Party. Ethnic minorities matter to the Labour Party. Anyone who argues that Andy Burnham should be the MP in this constituency clearly has a problem with both. As we reported yesterday, the rules for Labour candidate selection have been changed just this year, with Sky's Sam Coates reporting this from the new rulebook. So he says of the new rulebook, it says directly elected mayors and police and crime commissioners must seek the express permission of the NEC, SEC or WEC, as applicable, before seeking nomination as Labour candidate for the Westminster Parliament. Those decisions shall be final. I'm told Morgan McSweeney thinks he's got the NEC sewn up to block Burnham, but you never quite know. I should apologise. I haven't looked up what SEC or WEC mean before we go live, but I know what the NEC is. That's the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. Another idea has been floated to the Independent, with the paper reporting that the NEC is considering imposing a so-called loyalty pledge to Keir Starmer for new candidates, meaning they could later paint Burnham as a traitor if he launched a challenge. So one Labour MP in the Starmer camp told Politics Home this. The idea you can bully the Labour Party machine into spending money we don't have, spending time we don't have, and taking a risk we don't want to take to allow someone a shot at pushing the PM out of the window, it doesn't make any sense at all. Given the international context Keir is dealing with, it's nearly criminal. Now, the argument being made here is that if Andy Burnham becomes an MP, he would have to resign as mayor of Greater Manchester, and they're saying it would cost them some money to run that election. Now, I would say that more important than, I don't know, a few million, I've got no idea actually how much it costs to sort of run a campaign for Manchester mayor, but I think more valuable to a political party is to have some popular politicians, having some MPs that people don't hate or that even people like, I think is more important than a couple million quid. You know, money can't buy you popularity, and Andy Burnham has it and Keir Starmer doesn't. Other Labour MPs are a little more open to change. So one told the BBC this. The arrogance of Westminster to think that they can block the will of local party members and ultimately voters is symbolic of everything that's wrong with our political system and what people hate about politics. Another thought Starmer should show a little self-confidence, saying this. He's got vultures left, right, up, down, in, front and behind. He needs to man up and show he's happy to see off anyone. Speaking on Times Radio, the paper's, or the Times chief political commentator Patrick Maguire gave his take on whether the backroom wrangling would really serve Keir Starmer.
They've tried this before when they indicated in a briefing to the Times in June 2024 rather, that they wouldn't let Dan Abbott run. Then there was a week-long row. All it will take is Angela Rayner to come out and say it's wrong, some union leaders to come out and say it's wrong, Lucy Powell to say, look, I'm behind Keir Starmer as deputy leader, but my mandate's from the members and I can tell the overwhelming will of the members is for Andy Burnham to run. And then all of a sudden, the real source of power in the Labour Party, the not formalised channels, the power brokers, all of that, where your power really comes from as Labour leader will become clear. And it's not just with the rule book. And I think that's the risk here. And as you said at the top of the show, Ed, it's a huge declaration of weakness to block Andy Burnham. It's a sort of, I know this guy is coming in here and he's more popular than me. He could challenge me for my job, so I'm going to invoke procedures to do it. A self-confident leader would say, Andy, by all means, come in, join the cabinet. You're a great guy. You're a great talent, etc., etc. But there's no sign of them doing that. And I know this is causing a lot of consternation and back and forth in Downing Street and the cabinet.
That was Patrick Maguire, one of the more astute journalists who looks into the Labour Party. I'm sure he knows what the SEC and the WEC are. More professional journalists than me. One of those union leaders mentioned by Maguire has now spoken out. So Andrea Egan is the new General Secretary of Britain's largest union, Unison, and she's warned the Labour Party not to try to rig the selecting of a candidate for the Gordon and Denton seat. And she posted this online. I'm sure trade unionists expect a democratic process for Gordon and Denton in which local party members decide who they want to represent them. We've seen enough control freakery in the Labour Party and it has done our movement nothing but harm. What was interesting about that Patrick Maguire interview is he was suggesting it's not a done deal, because what lots of the briefers have been saying is that, look, the rule book is clear. If whoever controls the NEC does not want this man to stand, he shall not stand. And Patrick Maguire is saying we've actually got some precedent here. When pressure is large enough, the rule book doesn't necessarily matter. His example was Diane Abbott, which is quite right. They did have the votes on the NEC to block her, but then there was all this pushback, and then they decided, actually, this is too embarrassing now. We've got to let the people have what they want. And we're going to go back to that Times Radio interview because Patrick Maguire went on to talk about Burnham's popularity, even getting a little passionate.
And is he going to win the by-election?
Oh, look, I think this is classic Westminster too clever by half stuff.
Ooh.
Andy Burnham runs in a by-election in Greater Manchester. Of course he wins.
Really?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. He's the most...
It's a by-election, Patrick. The rules don't apply.
Yeah, of course the rules don't apply. Reform will give him a good go. George Galloway could run.
Yeah.
George Galloway kept his deposit in Manchester Gorton, slightly different constituency, but nonetheless he ran there in 2017 and kept his deposit. But I just think, look, Andy Burnham, in several mayoral elections, has won not just every borough of Greater Manchester, but every ward of Greater Manchester. The guy is like Kim Jong-un, right? Like, he is the most popular. He's the only Labour politician in the country with a positive approval rating. And I know this is quite difficult for people in Westminster to get into their heads. And yes, people who've worked with him might say, oh, he's indecisive, he's a bottle job, oh, he flip-flops, ha, 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 chips and gravy, all of that nonsense. But let's be honest with ourselves in Westminster. Lots of us need to get out of London, and yes, maybe I'm party pre, because like Andy Burnham, I'm a wool, I'm from the outer boroughs of Merseyside, but speaking to normal people in the north of England, they will tell you that they quite like Andy Burnham, and they might not be able to tell you why, but it's clear, and it doesn't matter if you want for lunch with Andy Burnham in the 90s at the River Cafe, and he seemed at home.
I took him to Chelsea Everton in the 90s.
Well, yeah, and you probably went for a drink in Soho, and he seemed at home. And yeah, he went to Cambridge. Yeah, he was a spad. But ultimately, regardless of whether you think this whole we always felt out of place in London, to be honest with you, Ed, is sincere or not,
Patrick
it
Maguire.
works.
Maguire isn't wrong about Andy Burnham's popularity in the polling. Although actually, I mean, it's not as cut and dry as he is potentially suggesting. According to the polls, I mean, he's saying sort of the word on the ground is that they love this guy. But new polling from Britain Predicts suggests that if Labour run any candidate except Burnham in Gordon and Denton, they could lose pretty substantially to Reform. Throw in Andy Burnham as Labour candidate and they draw level with Farage's party. Again, so not overwhelming, but better than with someone else. And then if you have a sprinkling of tactical voting, so that would be with some Greens and Lib Dems going to Labour and some Tory voters going for Reform, you get a Burnham victory with a 4-point lead over Reform. So not massively comfortable, but I suppose you'd presume also that he'd run a reasonable campaign, I suppose. ITV has also asked Manchester residents what they think about their mayor running as an MP.
I think there's a lot of people, especially around here, who would want Andy Burnham as the next Prime Minister.
I really don't have much trust in Labour because they've been a letdown, considering what's happened since Starmer came in. But Andy himself, I think he's done a few good things.
I'm undecided. There's some of the things he comes out with is good and other things I don't agree with.
I think would be a good idea.
I don't think he's got the people of Gorton in mind. I think he's doing it for personal reasons.
Helena. It does all seem a bit desperate, doesn't it? And also, if I were a Labour MP, obviously if you're Keir Starmer, you want to stay Prime Minister, obvious. But if you're a Labour MP and you're looking at the polling for the next general election and you're thinking, we cannot possibly go into an election with Keir Starmer, the least popular Prime Minister ever, I'm going to lose my seat. And there's this chance for a popular guy to come in and try and take over. You're going to be fuming if that's not allowed to happen, right? Because of the ego of Keir Starmer or because the international events are so important that we must have this incompetent guy with no personality licking Donald Trump's ass instead of someone else.
I mean, the funny thing is, I don't think Keir Starmer is even relevant here. It's Morgan McSweeney and his ilk. It's the people within the Politburo that are closing ranks upon Keir Starmer. And it's all people who are kind of hangers-on to that kind of grouping with at the top of the party that are doing briefings to the press, that are saying, oh, here's XYZ reason we can't do it. If you're going to have a policy platform, or at least a party that pretends to care about equity for disadvantaged groups, the cynically weaponizing the schemes that exist to be able to foment that equity, to try and undermine your political rivals within your own party, I mean, I think that it's awful. I mean, it's really, really bad. I mean, people at this point in time are really losing confidence in the idea of these kind of schemes. Obviously, the right wing talk about DEI, even it's called EDI in this country all the time. And the narrative is that it's being used cynically to try and put people who don't deserve to be in these positions into positions. And when the Labour Party are openly doing it in the way that the right say that it's always been being done, or it just calls that whole kind of political process into question. But it is, I mean, Patrick Maguire described this whole thing as weakness. And I think that's pretty diplomatic of him. I'd say it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. And it's because they know full well that there is no way, if there was ever any kind of actual internal party democracy, that they would keep control of the party that they fought so hard to have dictatorial control over. Because that's been the project from day one. When Maurice Glassman said it on Newsnight, they spent 5 years in opposition getting rid of the racists, the Corbyn supporters. One would assume that he was referring to there, to get control of the party, to be able to change the rule book and be able to modify all the processes to keep that centralised control within the kind of Politburo that they've created. And we've ended up with this weird Khrushchev-style scenario where the policy is failing, he's unpopular, nobody likes him, there is kind of massive unrest within the party outside of a really tight-knit group of people at the top, and it is becoming very much like the internal, like, kind of Communist Party of the Soviet Union style politics that was always levied at Jeremy Corbyn. Like, if this kind of stuff was being done in the Corbynite era of the Labour Party, the press would be having an absolute fever dream of attacks on Corbyn's role as the leader. Whereas you see the press talking about it now, very kind of nonchalant. It's all very, oh, well, I'm sure McSweeney thinks he has the NEC sewn up. I'm sure he does. Do you not think that maybe, as Andrew Egan pointed out, someone should ask the residents of Gorton and Denton, or even indeed members of the constituency Labour Party in Gorton and Denton, who'd they like their candidate to be? Maybe they don't want Andy Burnham. Maybe they do want the local council leader, but we're not going to know this because it's being caught up in the Westminster psychodrama of, is it going to be Andy Burnham? Is it going to be stopped by the NEC? Because it may be that he gets on the shortlist. He could well get on the shortlist if the Politburo think that it's too politically toxic to get this involved, because people don't like it. I mean, that's what the interviews on the ground have been saying. They don't like the political gamesmanship, the Westminster psychodrama. Then he could get on the shortlist out of embarrassment, and then he could lose the nomination to somebody that's been a long-standing, hard-working member of the constituency of Gorton and Denton. And of course, the reason we're in this position in the first place is because that same kind of finagling of the selection process has put in apparatchiks with a loyalty pledge to Starmer, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Like, if your leader is so unpopular, you have to force people to like them, then, again, that's not democracy.
And can also, like, the logic of that. So imagine if you've got Keir Starmer who's there, and then, like there's been terrible council elections, and there is people want a new leader. And then Andy Burnham, because it's also not going to be, if Andy Burnham does get into the PLP, it's not going to be him who wields the knife against Keir Starmer. It's going to be a stalking horse, and then he's going to stand for leader. So if someone else has brought down Keir Starmer, which will happen probably whether or not Andy Burnham is in the House of Commons, and then Andy Burnham is deciding whether to stand for leader, and he said, "Oh, I was going to stand for leader, but now I've signed this contract that I will remain loyal to Keir Starmer, that I couldn't possibly. So therefore, I will not stand. And in fact, I will endorse and publicly vote for Keir Starmer because I was forced to sign this covenant." It's like, it's so stupid.
Literally. I mean, and again, as far as I'm aware, the process, if Starmer doesn't actually resign after what's almost certainly going to be an incredibly humiliating set of local and devolved election losses in May, or potentially a damaging spring statement if the kind of international money markets are having the reaction to what's happening geopolitically that they are in America over here. There's plenty of reasons why he could theoretically resign, though he could potentially be in danger in terms of his leadership. He needs 80 people to nominate him to be the challenger, in which case he becomes on the ballot anyway. So even if he has signed this loyalty pledge, the mechanics of the Labour Party machine means that, well, he just gets foisted into the position because other members of the PLP have said, we would like this guy. And of course you would.
Yeah.
When you look at the polling, he's one of the only high-profile politicians who doesn't have a negative approval rating. His approval rating is 0, by the way, people viewing at home. That's how little politicians are liked in this country. More on that later in the show. But the fact that his approval rating isn't negative, if you were an MP in not even like a swing constituency, because they're gone. Like, you've only got like 3.5 years left of the gravy train, right? But if you're in a moderately safe Labour constituency that could be gobbled up by a Reform or a Green in the future, then you're going to leap at the chance for somebody who's not on, what's Keir Starmer's approval rating, -50? Something obscene like that. Like, yeah, well, it makes perfect sense to want to nominate Andy Burnham. And they know it. The Politburo know it. And so they're obviously taking increasingly desperate steps to prevent it from happening.
They're also going to have a real problem getting someone to stand in the seat if they block Andy Burnham, because, clearly, well, for one, you're probably going to lose. 2, you're going to obviously have been a DEI candidate. So sort of like, one of the big problems with DEI is if you then get a role as a woman or a person of colour, then people call you a DEI candidate. And the worst thing the worst sort of run up to that can be there was a really popular, competent white guy who wanted the job. And then really publicly, the factional opponent of that fairly popular white guy said, he can't do it. We need a woman. We need a woman or a person of colour. And then that's just, you don't want to be the DEI candidate who then loses. And that's why, it was the case that Bev Craig, who is the leader of Manchester Council, she was, touted maybe she'll go for the seat. And now I think Michael Crick was tweeting that a source says she's not going to go for the seat. And of course, you're not going to want to go for the seat to be shown to be sort of the stale candidate that Keir Starmer's not afraid of. who's managed to get there because there was a cynical use of an all-women shortlist or an all-BAME shortlist, which people have been saying is probably illegal.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and again, it's just interfering with party democracy. Again, outside of what should be outside of the Westminster bubble. It's another situation in which people who live anywhere outside of London are having Westminster dictate to them how they should engage in their politics, right? Again, like maybe Andy Burnham makes the shortlist and loses to somebody else. That should be a choice for the people of Gorton and Denton, rather than for whatever's happening hundreds of miles away in London to save the skin of a guy who has no justification in having his skin saved in the first place. But you're right. And on top of that, you probably wouldn't want to get selected either. Apparently, the rumour mill is saying that there's a potential that Zia Yusuf could be the selected reform candidate because he's their biggest media figure that's not already a member of parliament. It's like him, David Bull and Layla Cunningham, who aren't really elected, but are big spokespeople for them. They want him into parliament, right? Does anyone really want to have to go up against the Reform Party online machine as a lowly, like, ward councillor?
I don't think he's from Manchester, is he?
No, he's not. But since when did anyone
So it
from
doesn't matter that
Reform
much.
care about the North
Yeah.
other than kind of performatively?
Layla Cunningham is going for London Mayor, isn't she?
That's true.
In Syria, a battle is underway that will decide the future political shape of the country. On one side is the Syrian transitional government led by Ahmed al-Sharaa in Damascus, also known or formerly known as al-Jalani. That's the name he used when fighting for the Islamist groups Al-Qaeda and the Al-Nusra Front. In 2024, Sharaa and his Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces, or HTS, overthrew the Assad government, taking over the country's administration as well as its army. On the other side is the semi-autonomous Kurdish region of northeastern Turkey called the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava, and defended by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Now, until recently, the autonomous region, shown here in yellow, covered about a third of Syria, including Kurdish majority areas like Kobani, called by its Arabic name Ain al-Arab on this map, and Kamishlo in the country's north. It also included Arab majority areas like Raqqa, formerly the capital of the so-called ISIS Caliphate, as well as more ethnically diverse areas like Hasakeh in the northeast. The areas in red were occupied by anti-Kurdish forces aligned with Turkey from 2016 onwards, and the green areas were controlled by the Syrian transitional government. Complicated map. But what you saw there, what sort of jumps out at you, is that the SDF, the Kurdish forces, controlled a lot of Syria. They were in the yellow sections. So how did that happen? Well, it's because the Kurdish-led forces, including their all-women YPJ battalions, were famously responsible for driving ISIS out of that region, routing Islamic State almost completely by 2019, at the cost of at least 12,000 SDF fighters. In that battle, they were supported by an international coalition consisting of US, British and French forces, amongst others. And that's where the situation stood until around a week ago. So what has changed since then? Well, we can look at the latest map of the region now. And as you can see here, forces aligned with the Syrian transitional government, again in green, have taken swathes of SDF territory, pushing the force back into traditional Kurdish strongholds. Along the way, the government forces have taken control of jails holding ISIS prisoners, including the Shadadi prison, shown here near Hezek. They've also taken control of the Al-Hol prison camp, which held thousands of ISIS family members, including wives and children, many of whom have been in prison since 2019 or even earlier. Now, there are mixed reports about what has happened in those camps and prisons since the SDF retreated. The Damascus government has accused the SDF of releasing ISIS prisoners from Shadadi jail, while the SDF say the government set them free. 1,000 SDF fighters have now also retreated from Al-Aqtan prison near Raqqa, where they've been holding off government forces for days. That's now in Damascus's control as well. The fear amongst Kurds and their allies is that the Syrian government, along with various militias involved in the Syrian army, will be sympathetic to those held there, possibly releasing them. And in a sign that the US doesn't trust the Syrian government to manage security in the region, it announced on Wednesday that it would be transferring 7,000 ISIS prisoners to Iraq. It's also feared that, at the very least, the chaos will embolden ISIS cells still operating in some parts of northern Syria. The view of the Syrian transitional government is different. They say they just want to end the autonomy of Rojava and fold the SDF into the Syrian army from their stated perspective. This is simply nation building. But Rojava operates under a very different political system, or a very different political system than that envisioned by Syria's new national government. Women play a very active role in political governance as well as the military, and the zone is run on broadly libertarian socialist principles, hence the reference to a Rojava revolution. And while many Kurds are Muslim, they run their region on secular principles. Now, it's unclear whether the Damascus government, run by Islamists, would allow those principles to continue if it controlled the region. And there have also been videos believed to be authentic by the Rojava Information Center showing government forces beheading a woman SDF fighter and throwing the body of another from a building. Footage shared online also shows a fighter holding the cut-off braid of another woman fighter after she was killed. And we haven't been able to verify that. There have also been reports, or the SDF have been accused of violence by Syrian government allies, including violence against civilians, which we haven't been able to verify. What's certainly true is that the fighting between the SDF and the government forces has been fierce, resulting in the killing of an estimated 1,000 people. That was due, or the fighting was due to come to an end on Tuesday when a sudden ceasefire was announced by the al-Shara government. Now, Reuters has the inside track on what led to that surprise ceasefire. So they report this. Al-Shara's forces had swiftly recaptured Arab-majority provinces from the SDF and kept advancing. By January 19th, they were encircling the final Kurdish-held cities in Syria's northeast, despite a ceasefire announced the previous day. But the US administration was angry that Syrian troops had ignored the truce and feared mass violence against Kurdish civilians. That's what they've been told by US sources. Two of the sources said US lawmakers were considering reimposing sanctions on Syria if fighting continued. A White House official told Reuters the US was monitoring developments in Syria with grave concern and urged all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians across all minority groups. With his forces approaching the Kurds' last stronghold, Shara suddenly announced a new ceasefire on Tuesday. He said his troops would not proceed if the SDF proposed an integration plan by the end of the week. That's a plan for integrating into the national army, I suppose. It's not clear that the ceasefire has been anything more than symbolic, though. The Kurdish stronghold of Kobani on the Syrian-Turkish border is reportedly under siege, with electricity and internet cut off. And further east, another border city, Kamishlo, which has a diverse population of Arabs, Kurds and Christians, is waiting tensely to see what happens when the ceasefire ends tomorrow. Meanwhile, there has been a call for a mass mobilization of Kurds to come to the aid of Rojava. Turkish Kurds have been amassing and protesting in the town of Suruk, just across the border from besieged Kobani, in solidarity with Rojava. There have been similar scenes further east in Turkey, in the town of Nusaybin, across the border from Kashmilo, where the police have tried to suppress the protests. In Iraq, Kurds have been amassing too, protesting what they regard as existential threat to Kurds in Syria. There have been some suggestions that Kurdish reinforcements from Iraq may cross the border to fight with the SDF as well. Earlier today, I was joined by Meghan Bodette, Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute. She spoke to me from the city of Kamishlo in Rojava.
So right now, the communities that I'm speaking to are very concerned about potential Syrian transitional government advances into these predominantly Kurdish areas here in the north. The city has already received waves of displaced people, mostly communities from the Kurdish region of Afrin, who have been displaced 3 or 4 times since the 2018 Turkish invasion of Afrin, who most recently would have fled either the Sheikh Maksud neighborhood of Aleppo or government advances towards their camps in the Raqqa and Tabqa region. The weather right now is very cold. There were about 3 inches of snow on the ground today. This is, of course, making the humanitarian situation worse. But in the end, morale is very high. These communities know that while at the same time as, they are under attack, they are, concerned about the breakdown of this sort of fragile ceasefire that's existed between government forces and Kurdish forces for the past few days. They understand that they are defending, their existence. They've seen a lot of solidarity from Kurdish communities across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan and in the Kurdish regions of Turkey as well. And they don't plan to give up on their fundamental rights and, efforts for self-determination.
And obviously the Kurdish-led forces fought with the Americans against ISIS very bravely. there's a large narrative that now those Kurdish-led forces are being abandoned. It was also the case, though, that the Americans had pushed for this ceasefire. So there does seem to be some interest in Washington in still defending their former allies. What's your understanding of Washington's role in what's going on right now?
Well, I think that for both sides, contrary to a lot of the narratives, there was always an understanding that this partnership was about interests, right? You had at Kobani in 2014 a well-trained, very tough Kurdish force that was willing to resist past a point where many other Middle Eastern armed forces, had already capitulated to ISIS in the YPG and the YPJ there. And then you had the Americans who felt the need to do something to respond to the ISIS threat, but were not willing to commit ground troops of their own and did not find the kind of partners in regional states that they were looking for. So there was always this understanding that this was something based on interests, not a proxy war, not a confluence of values. But at the same time, I think when we look at the steps that the U.S. took following the fall of the regime, again, these were interests-based. The U.S. saw the opportunity to kind of move Syria from what it saw as the Russian camp to the pro-American camp, as it were. It wanted some level of, economic stake or interest in Syria. And what that led to was an interest in some basic level of security. Because, of course, if you have chaos reigning and ongoing conflict, you can't really do either of those things. And then for very different reasons, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Kurds and other communities in the Northeast had an interest in stability because they wanted to protect, the level of local decentralized self-government and self-defense that they had already created. And so again, there was a convergent interest on the part of many different parties in a negotiated settlement to this issue that would sort of merge these regions with the rest of the country while allowing them to keep some degree of autonomy. I think, though, the problem with these convergent interests is they can always diverge. And we saw in a meeting in Paris, just before this round of violence broke out, the U.S. had brokered an agreement between Syria and Israel. Turkey was involved in that as well. We see from a lot of the reporting that essentially the U.S. gave a blessing to Israel and Turkey for the Israelis to take southern Syria as their zone of influence and the Turks to take northern Syria as their zone of influence. This leading to, I think, a green light for Damascus to go after the Kurdish areas. But again, I think what all parties failed to account for here was the fact that Syrian Kurds would resist, that they would try to hold on to what they had gained, right? We saw very rapidly the fall of Arab majority regions with, tribes that had sided with the SDF for a variety of pragmatic reasons, finding a better case and siding with the Syrian government. But in Kurdish regions, the organized social base of the Kurdish movement and the Kurdish community as a whole, they're not interested in submitting to an authority that's not going to allow them to enjoy at least the same level of rights and self-governance as they have had, under the autonomous administration. And I don't think that was really accounted for. I especially don't think the sort of regional Kurdish mobilization was accounted for. And so now, in order to preserve stability and prevent Syria from becoming a site of crisis again, to create an environment where you can do things like counter ISIS operations or pursue economic interests, they're once again looking for a diplomatic way to solve this. And I think that that's kind of how we can explain that, without getting into these narratives of betrayal or these narratives of proxies being used. It's all, at the end of the day, an interests game. And when people organize themselves and resist, they can have, a say in those interests, at a very difficult time in their history.
And there obviously is a model of an autonomous Kurdish region in the region, which is sort of post-war Iraq. Is that the kind of settlement that you would favor in Syria? So it would be part of a central Syria or a centralized Syria, but with lots of autonomy for the Kurdish-led zone. Is that the outcome you would be seeking?
Well, I think that, it's not so much what we're seeking. What I'm paying attention to is what, people here are looking for. And they're not looking for something exactly like what Iraqi Kurds have, right? There's some differences in northern Syria. instead of one contiguous Kurdish majority region, you have smaller Kurdish regions, that are populated by, concentrated Kurdish populations, separated by Arab populations. I think, viewers might know during the reign of the Assad regime, in the second half of the 20th century, the regime moved many Arab Syrians into Kurdish areas through a project called the Arab Belt in order to sort of break up any kind of Kurdish demographic base for an autonomous region. And then you also have the fact that many of these regions, even, aside from Kurds and Arabs, have very diverse populations. You'll see Yazidi villages, you'll see Christian villages. So the idea that you can simply take one region and make it the Kurdish region is a little bit simplistic. There are also many Kurds who've been displaced through the course of the war. Many Kurds from the region of Afrin in northwestern Syria have were forced from their homes during the Turkish occupation in 2018. Some are trying to return now. I've spoken to many people from Afrin who have attempted to return. They still face difficulties with threats from Turkish-backed militias that have been integrated into the new government. Government forces will say outright to people that they're incapable of helping people protect themselves from militias. And then there are people from Afrin who have chosen not to take the risk of returning to their homes, who are still displaced in northeastern Syria. So there's a question of how would you create a Kurdish region and also resolve the status of Kurds who, don't live in the places where they used to live anymore. And then I think the political goals of northeast Syria extend beyond just this Kurdish self-determination, right? For them, they place a very high priority, for example, on freedom of religion. Right? Here in Kamishlo, from where I'm giving this interview right now, I could walk to a church, I could walk to a mosque, I could walk to a restaurant that sells alcoholic beverages where people go and party and wear, very westernized clothes. You see women who dress like American and European women. You see women, wearing a full headscarf or a full face veil. There's a really incredible diversity, not just between different religions, but of observance, within individual religious communities. And that is protected here. Nobody gets in anyone's way. You have the role of women that has been, I think, very famous around the world. Everybody knows about the YPJ, the Kurdish female fighters. But within the political system itself, for example, every political institution here must have a male and female co-chair to ensure that, women have equal power in leadership. There are autonomous women's institutions parallel to every kind of, mixed gender overall political institution that, follow up with the interests of women in those institutions and in the communities they serve. The social contract of the region gives women, the right to full equality in both public and private life, which is something that's very radical. In many of our countries in the West, we don't have those kinds of provisions. So, and then there's an overall attempt at creating, a more democratic, decentralized system of governance and economy and, all of these ways of life, a lot of which has been overshadowed by kind of the necessities of war, but which is still something that I think a lot of people, when they started out, wanted to achieve and would still want to achieve in any settlement, right? So when you take all of these together, I think that the model that people are looking at now realistically is going to be something where, these Kurdish cities and Kurdish regions have very strong local government. They have some degree of control over the local security forces, and they have enough power, in those institutions to allow extra institutional political organizing to go on. If any viewers know about kind of the municipal model that the Kurdish movement has in Turkey, where you have both, elected officials in the official system and very strong community organizing, I imagine it would look something like that, but with, of course, a higher degree of autonomy. That's what I think is realistic. When I think you look at what people want, when we see Kurds from Iraqi Kurdistan cross the border to go join the YPG and, defend Kurdish communities, or when we see, the breakdown of the border wall in Nusaybin and Kurds from Turkey, pouring into Kamishlo to go support people there, you can see that the spirit of self-determination and this concept of a greater Kurdish nation is still very much alive. And while the borders might be as they are today, I think that this mobilization has shown that, in people's hearts and minds, those borders are still seen as an imposition and as something to be worked against. So that's also important to note.
I suppose you've talked very powerfully about the positive vision that you're defending, let's talk about what you're up against. And I suppose the nature of the central Syrian government forces that are now fighting the Kurdish-led forces. What type of army is this? I mean, there's lots of talk of a return of ISIS. I'm not sure if that's alarmist, but if these Kurdish-led regions fall, is it just a case that, you won't get everything you want, but it will be relatively livable, or is it the case that this will be complete disaster?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, it's unlikely to be livable for many people. The government's forces are made up of a combination of the former Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was a radical Islamist militant group, the forces of the Syrian National Army, which were a coalition of militias backed by Turkey, some of which were Islamist, some of which were rather Arab nationalist, and many of which were simply very opportunistic criminals who saw the war as an opportunity to enrich themselves. The government has been mobilizing tribal militias as well. These are people who are not trained or not, really engaged in any kind of professional military activity at all, but are, very angry and often have very strong ethno-sectarian grievances with the communities here. So we're not really talking about a state army in the sense that the average viewer might understand it. We're talking about a collection of armed groups, with different ideologies and different interests. And many of those ideologies and interests are very hostile to not just Kurdish political self-determination, but to, the presence of Kurds in Syria at all, and to other ethnic and religious minority communities as well. I think that if they were to take over these areas, we would see something similar to what, if you followed Syria, we saw happen in Afrin in 2018 and Serikani in 2019. These were two Kurdish majority cities that were occupied by Turkey, where there was mass displacement of Kurdish populations, amounting to, according to many researchers and monitors, ethnic cleansing. There were kidnappings and disappearances of people who remained. There were patterns of sexual and gender-based violence against women. There were executions of people who had worked with the local administration, who were seen as politically active. And, there were efforts to permanently change these demographics of these regions by means of violence in such a way that would prevent any Kurdish political project from becoming politically feasible. This was incredibly dangerous. I've documented many cases and spoke to many, many victims of, these crimes in Afrin. This is something that we worked on very closely at the Institute. And when I talk to people here in Kamishlo and in Kobani now, they fear that same outcome of potentially, the ethnic cleansing of the Syrian Kurdish population indefinitely, and very serious abuses against the people who might stay. And while there are signs that this outcome can be avoided, when we look at the ceasefire that has been, if fragile, holding in place for the past few days, when we look at the agreement that the government made with the SDF, which says on paper that government military forces will stay out of Kurdish populated areas, these are signs for hope that a worst case scenario might be avoided. But I think that when we look at the behavior of the government, we've seen that they haven't always followed through on ceasefires. And when you have these very fragile front lines, when tensions are very high, a small incident between low-level units or field commanders can blow up into something that can really sabotage the whole agreement. And this is part of why, I think people are very on edge because the stakes are so high. There's zero trust, between the two parties. And look, people in the Kurdish regions of Syria have already contended with attacks by Islamist groups like ISIS, by a state that wants to marginalize Kurdish communities and displace them from their land, like Turkey. And now they're seeing really a combination of both of those tendencies. And they're very concerned about what is waiting for them if diplomacy fails.
And finally, let's just talk about some of the abuses. Well, abuses is an understatement that we've sort of seen so far, or that we've potentially seen so far, because I think from our perspective, it's quite difficult to sort of know exactly what is going on, what can be verified. So there have been videos showing government forces beheading a woman SDF fighter and throwing another from a building. Also of a fighter holding the cut-off braid of another woman fighter after she was killed. Are you aware of these? What kind of brutality are we seeing from the Syrian government forces?
Yeah, I've seen these videos. We've seen, I think, these reports of extrajudicial executions, the humiliation of prisoners and of, the bodies of fighters killed in combat. There's a video circulating of tribal fighters, aligned with the government, who have captured 2 Kurdish female fighters who are mocking them and saying that they're going to give them as a gift to one of their commanders. This, of course, is reminiscent, to people here of the crimes that ISIS committed, of the kidnap and enslavement of thousands of Yazidi women and children in Sinjar. I think that when we see these abuses, we see something very reminiscent of, again, these past horrors that the Kurdish communities have lived through. And again, this threat of a conflict that is seen, not as an attack by, one political force against another political force, but as a war on the existence of a particular community, that can get very ugly and very dangerous very fast. Honestly, we've seen signs that this aggression might even spill out of Syria. Today I saw a report of a stabbing at a Kurdish protest in Belgium. So even in Europe, there may be people who are radicalized enough to go after, peaceful Kurdish demonstrators, likely European citizens, people simply going about their lives and exercising their right to protest. So this is very dangerous, because it's not something that's going to stay confined to simply the government versus the Kurds in Syria, but it's spreading this wave of hatred of Kurdish communities, around the region. And I think that that's something that's extremely concerning. It's also worth noting that, a lot of the tactics that the government has been using have made it so we can't really get information about what's going on. Internet has been cut off in the city of Kobani, for example. We know that Kobani doesn't have access to electricity other than generators. We know that there have been cuts to the water supply. There's no roads in or out, and it's a small city. So when they run out of things like food or medicine, there's not a lot there, and it's very difficult for them to get that in. So you have these larger scale abuses as well, kind of, besieging this population and making it impossible for them to get information out. So we don't actually even know the scope of how bad it is. Again, I think that's very concerning. And this is one of the reasons why, we're pushing very hard in our conversations with people in the analysis that we're putting out for the roads to be open to Kobani, for the power and water and internet to be turned back on, and for these civilian populations to be able to access these basic needs.
Liberal democracy is on the brink. That's the conclusion from the data guru at the Financial Times this week, who says the old system worked under a set of conditions that are no longer present. The conditions that existed when liberal democracies flourished were economic growth and growing working age populations. Both have stalled or gone into reverse. That's according to this argument. And John Murdoch says this: democratic backsliding, the advance of populists, and the breakdown of the liberal world order have all tracked a clear economic and demographic slowdown. Viewed through this lens, the political and geopolitical turmoil of the past decade is not an aberration or a series of special cases, but the new normal. This is the chart he uses to show the historical relationship, or at least correlation, between liberal democracy and economic growth rate. So this is looking just at high-income countries. The red line shows annual growth rates. The blue line shows the average scores among rich countries on a liberal democracy index. That's obviously sort of a somewhat artificial construct, which measures the extent of voting rights, freedom of expression, and executive constraints. As you can see, they track each other quite closely. So in the years after the Second World War, there was a very high growth, and liberal democracy flourished. Since the 2000s, growth has slowed and liberal democracy has gone into retreat. So it's probably more likely those countries where freedom of the press or freedom of association has been undermined, because there aren't many sort of things which are sort of clearly democracies that have become where people don't vote anymore. It's more that sort of liberalism. The liberal elements of liberal democracy are in decline. So what might be the relationship? Obviously, we know correlation is not causation. But should there be a mechanism that would connect these two phenomenons? John Byrne Murdoch writes this. Research finds that key underpinnings of liberal democratic societies, such as trust and cooperation between different communities and nations, are fostered by rising prosperity. It creates optimism and serves as proof for core ideals, such as the belief that we all gain if we put the greater good and long-term thinking ahead of narrow self-interest and short-termism. Economic growth also helps reduce ethnic and other intergroup tensions, increasing trust by weakening the sense of fighting over a fixed pool of resources. The new low-growth world of zero-sum competition and ageing populations is fundamentally different, and it follows that it will have fundamentally different politics. Stagnation breeds a politics of impatience, self-interest, hostility towards outgroups, and a smash-the-system disregard for norms and institutions that were centuries in the making. Helena, I want your view on this. I suppose in the degrowth argument, which often sort of arises, my position is always that on a global level, absolutely not. We need growth. There are still many poor people in the world. India needs rapid growth. Most of Africa needs rapid growth. China could still do with some more growth. In the West, I'm sort of agnostic. I think, probably we could all have a good enough standard of living if we distributed a bit more. But the argument I find very strong against degrowth, even in the rich countries, is that democracy struggles when we're not growing. Do you think that democracy can survive a world with very low growth rates?
There's lots of questions to this. So I'm always going to be skeptical of any analysis that looks at two trends and then tries to infer causation from correlation. I think it's a really important caveat. I do think that there is plenty of good logic that he's presented, however, to make that link. Well, what is interesting between those two graphs is that the growth trails the liberal democracy index. It does seem to me that whilst there is some level of a correlation, it does seem to me that liberal democracy is the platform to create that growth, right? So there's something there, I think, that is worth looking into to see. I think it is important to understand that, sure, those kind of zero-sum thoughts about fixed pools of resources has been the historical norm through human history, especially developing human history, right? Imperialism has always been fighting over resources, and being able to use growth, which is essentially all from a thing called total factor productivity, i.e. being able to make more things with the same amount of labour and capital, has been the bedrock on which the innovation that's come from liberal democracy has been able to improve living standards without having to fight over scarce resources, whilst having a framework there to ensure that there is some kind of non-corrupt way of being able to ensure that people understand the framework with which they're bargaining for the resources that exist. And if that breaks down, there's a problem. The issues that I have with the analysis, though, is that there have been plenty of non-liberal democratic societies, i.e. you look at, for example, I'm a bit of a Yugo boost, I'm going to talk about socialist Yugoslavia again, which is that they had significant levels of growth during this period, which John Byrne Murdoch points out in this graph, where you link the liberal democracy index and high growth rates, right? And it was indeed after a collapse in growth where you started to see more levels of social distrust, more levels of zero-sum thought, which ended in the Yugoslav wars and fighting between perceived national interests of the constituent nations. But they weren't a liberal democracy. They were a socialist dictatorship, right? I thought a pretty trusting socialist dictatorship, very well-functioning one, as far as I can see. But it was still that lack of growth that led to a societal breakdown. But there are other examples where you look at America. Cale Moran from Unlearn Economics made a really important point about the idea that growth would be the end of the lack of growth would be the capitulation of European politics, and saying, well, look at America. Even in a post-2008 world, they've been having really good growth. In fact, they're one of the only kind of major Western economies that's had very high growth. Has that solved their political problems? Has that reduced the levels of zero-sum thinking? Has that created more societal unity? Arguably, no. Arguably, their internal political problems are worse than they are in plenty of Western European countries. I would say arguably significantly worse than they are in the United Kingdom, despite the fact probably we're more unequal, especially regionally, than the United States is. So is it going to be a panacea to gain that economic growth? Well, the example of the United States would say no. But actually, there is something more that's afoot here. And I think the problem that we have is that liberalism has therefore created neoliberalism. It's been born out of it. And even in a world of growth, when all of the proceeds of that growth is going into the pockets of very, very few people. There's not the guardrails and the redistribution of the embedded liberalism of the post-war period. This kind of zero-sum politics is inevitable, with whether you have a liberal democracy or not. And of course, there's plenty of geopolitics happening that's going to be breaking down the system that previously had at least some kind of rudimentary set of rules to decide who has access to what resources, even if it was heavily slanted towards the global north because of imperialism and the way in which it was set up by the United States in their interests in the first place. So there's lots of questions about this, but clearly we have to be worried about what's going to happen if these kind of mindsets that I think the argument that have been created somewhat by low growth have embedded in societies, and how we combat that. How do we get, if growth is necessary, how do we get it in a world with vanishing productivity growth? Or if it can fight it without economic growth, how do we do that? Lots of questions.
Yeah, I suppose I just think there are so many explanations, it's difficult to pass them apart, isn't it? I think clearly liberal democracy is easier with growth because distributional concerns, you can, I suppose like New Labour is an example, right? Because they had high growth rates, they could redistribute to poorer people without having a big row with business. And that sort of meant that it all could kind of tick along quite nicely. Even in sort of the social democracies in the post-war period, where there was a lot more class consciousness and class war, there was a compromise that could be reached between the capitalists and the workers because growth meant that there was just more to share all the time. Now you've got a lot more conflict. And yeah, that could sort of come out in class conflict, which I think would probably be healthy to some degree. It's also coming out in ethnic conflict, which is less healthy, I think. I do think social media is probably as big an issue as growth. I mean, it's difficult to pass the two. I've got this graphic. Can we get this graphic up? So it's public trust in government in the United States. And as you can see, so it's really high in the 1960s, where you did have high growth, but also, everyone watched the same 2 TV channels and read newspapers, which were written by people who were very cozy with elites in Washington. Then it goes down. You have the Vietnam War, you have Watergate. It goes up again a bit when Reagan is quite popular and there's high levels of growth. Goes down under Bush. Do you have a little recession there? I'm not quite sure. Then obviously you got like strong growth rates under Clinton, so it goes up. He's quite popular. Peaks at 9/11, goes down sort of under Bush, so you can sort of, that's when the war in Iraq sort of flops. And then it sort of reaches 20%. And then the thing that stands out from you there is not that it's not that it's lower than it's ever been, because it was sort of low in the mid-90s as well. But it's that it cannot get off that base. So it does seem like whatever happens, it stays at about 20%. And obviously, between 2008 and now, growth has been slow compared to previous eras. But in America, at least, it's picked up at times, it's gone down at times. And I just think that with everyone looking at their own social media feed, I feel like even if things got quite good, people would still just be super negative about it. And that you can probably never have a period where more than 20% of people like their government now.
Well, I buy that argument, but I think what's interesting to me, it seems to be a really big correlation between the advent of social media and the 2008 financial crisis, right? And obviously, the really kind of big ticking time bomb of these
They
two
happen at the same time, which is really annoying for social science.
It's so true, because, the fact that all of the boom growth that happened in the 90s and the early 2000s was essentially built off the fumes of the financial sector that exploded in 2008. No one was punished for this, right? One thing that I think that creates social unity, regardless of what your system looks like, whether you're a liberal or not, whether you're a democracy or not, whatever it is the feeling that there's a social contract at play there. And 2008 blew that apart. It absolutely annihilated the idea that there was a social contract, that people had some level of responsibility. And the fact that in lots of Western nations outside of, basically just Iceland, I guess, bankers got away scot-free. They were bailed out by the government. No one was properly punished for this. The people who bore the brunt of most of these problems were normal people fighting amongst themselves, whether you're blaming minorities or whatever it is, whether it's migrants that are the issues for the post-2008 kind of stagnation in living standards for ordinary people. Because whether there was growth, right, that was all sucked up by the super rich. It was sucked up by, well, the kind of the nouveau oligarchs in a post-2008 era. And social media or not, that level of discord that was directed towards outgroups is reminiscent of a time pre-social media to me. But the fact that even if there is growth, it's not going to the people. It's not going to the people who do the work. And they don't see that, A, the work that they do to keep society going is being remunerated adequately in the way that it was pre-2008, but the people who were solely responsible for the destruction of huge amounts of what was gained pre-2008 not being punished or held to account and bailed out. A social contract breaking down in that way is very difficult to be able to recover, and will lead to people thinking, well, if there's nothing that I'm getting out from putting in, I have to go inward. I have to protect my thing. I have to be inward facing rather than outward facing, because what did outward facing politics get me when the people who were supposed to be the ones stewarding the economy didn't help me and didn't help the people who I care about at a time when the economy was in collapse?
I think I think they should have jailed some bankers, absolutely, and I think that should have been used as a political opportunity by the likes of Gordon Brown and even Barack Obama to say, let's move away from this rentier-based system and have a whole new economy. They should have done that. But I think I'm not really convinced by the idea that people remember what happened in 2008 to the extent that they'll never regain their trust. I think it's more structural than that. And I suppose why I think it not budging since 2008 is what's relevant there, because there have been loads of periods in sort of modern history where people have sort of been outraged at something the government has done. So looking at America, you've got Watergate, you've got the Vietnam War, a couple other things, and then sort of trust plummets. But then it recovers as people sort of forget and they look around and they say, like, oh, actually, maybe things are working again. And I don't think that the reason people don't have trust now is because of something they remember in 2008 or 2010. I think it's like there is something about the structure of our society now, which means everyone hates the government.
Well, I think the thing that
everywhere.
I think the thing that people hate is the structure that led to 2008. I mean, it'll be specifically the bankers that they remember, right? But it's a society where there are no rules for oligarchs and there are rules for everybody else, which is essentially the parable.
But if you ask them about issues, like, yeah, some of them would say that. Lots of them say immigration. You know, there's all sorts of issues that people would say, but everyone's just a bit angrier now about everything.
That's true. But I think the zero-sum thought is a byproduct of an economic base that has not been able to turn economic growth into better proceeds for working class people, and they don't feel like. Because not only do they not have remuneration from the social contract that they've paid into, where's the sense of purpose in this kind of world either? That's one thing I think that's causing a lot of mental health problems as well, which is part and parcel of this societal breakdown, is that people don't have a vocational sense of purpose when that social contract isn't fulfilled. Like, if you're not going to work to be able to create something for yourself, if all you're doing is, you know, delivering food for Uber Eats or whatever it is, does that give you purpose in life? And again, without that leading to something like a stable life or a family or being able to afford a house or being able to go on holiday or run a car, which a lot of these people can't afford, that's a superstructure of a bigger problem with which the people, again, even if there was no growth, they could still be kind of living standards living standards that would be, whilst they'd be stagnant, they wouldn't be dropping, is what I'm saying, right? And that's there's a differential between what was previous, where we did get access to those things, ordinary people did, and now we don't.
Yeah, I suppose we're going to wrap up now. I agree with a lot of what you've said. I suppose because the rejection of sort of like trust in government is so widespread. Like, if it were about homeowners, if it were about sort of young people can't buy houses, then what you'd expect is older homeowners to have confidence in the government and younger non-homeowners to not have confidence. If it was about purpose, yeah, there are lots of people doing jobs that don't have purpose. There are also lots of people doing jobs that do have purpose, and they also hate the government.
That's true.
So it's sort of like, if you've got a house or you don't have a house, you hate the government. If you've got a really meaningful job or not a meaningful job, you hate the government. So it's sort of, it doesn't seem to me like it can be about one of those things, because whether or not you got the home, whether or not you got the good job, you hate the government, which is why I feel like I think it's social media. Come back on Monday for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Have a fantastic weekend and good night.